Hi everyone, welcome back to Code Realm. In this video, we're going to talk about Context API. Now, you might have heard the term Unidirectional Dataflow. What that basically means in the context of React is that data always flows in one direction, up from a parent component down to a child. You might have also heard the expression state up, props down. And that basically means that any shared data between two components needs to be lifted up to a parent component, and that parent component needs to communicate the data through properties down to those two child components. And this is obviously done through properties. Now, this works fine for simple applications. In more complex applications, people face what's known as global state. And this often refers to the data that is being shared by multiple segments of the user interface. That data needs to be centralized in a single place. Now, that place is often referred to as the single source of truth. In practice, it's often centralized in a single root component that is going to be a container component and will also hold the store for the application. In our exercise database, this stateful component is the app component, and it basically contains all of the application state that all of the components down the tree are going to use. Now, because it's often difficult to pass down the data through properties, people often use open source libraries for state management, such as Redux, Flux, MobX, and there's a lot of other ones as well. But for a small to medium-sized application, a third-party library might be an overkill because it introduces a lot of boilerplate code that you don't necessarily need if you just have a handful of components. You can obviously still use properties. So for example, in our application over here, we have a dialog for creating exercises. Now that dialog needs to know about the categories of muscles that the application provides. So the dropdown needs to know about all of the categories that are available in the application. Now those categories are centralized in store.js file. We import those categories as muscles, and then we pass them down to all of the other components. In this case, we're passing down the muscles to the header. The header component is going to pass down the properties to create dialog, and then the dialog itself is also going to pass down those properties to the form. Now the challenge in this case is that we want to pass down the muscles from the app.js file, so from the app component, down to the dialog component. But the dialog component is a child of header, and so we have to first pass down the properties to the header component, as we do in app.js file over here. So even though the header component doesn't need to know about muscles, and it doesn't need to know about the onExerciseCreate function, it still has to accept those properties, because in this case, this component acts as a middleman. It accepts those two props, and then it passes them down to the dialog. You can probably already see that the header component doesn't actually need to know about those two properties. In fact, it doesn't even use them, and it can really care less about them. Now in this case, it's only one component, but imagine if you had more components in between. If your dialog is deeply nested down the tree, you're gonna have to pass down those two properties through every single intermediary component in between. So the question really becomes, is there a way to pass the data from a single root component, which in this case is the app component, down to any child, regardless of how far that component is buried down the tree? Now the answer is actually yes. So if we switch to the React documentation over here, I'm going to click on Docs, I'll go to Advanced Guides, and let's click on Context. So this article over here is going to provide you with the basic information about Context API. Context API is available in React as of version 16.3, and its premise is fairly simple. It allows you to transmit the data without actually having to manually pass it down through the properties. And just like with the regular props, if that data changes, then the child components are also going to be re-rendered. So what I'm going to do over here is I'll switch back to our application, and inside the source directory, I'm going to create a new file. Let's call it context.js. Inside this file, we're going to have an import of a function known as createContext, and this one is going to come from React. Now, of course, you could also import React itself, and then you can reference createContext function off of it directly if you wanted to. All we have to do to create a context is to basically call that function. Now, that function is going to return an object, so we could basically assign it to a variable. We could call it context, but it's also useful to destructure the two special properties off of that object. Those two properties are actually components, and those are provider as well as consumer. What we can do inside this file is we can actually export those two constants because we're going to be using them throughout the app. So to demonstrate how you can actually use those two components, I'm going to go back to app. Let's have an import statement of provider from context. Now, like I always say, the .js extension is optional, and because of that, I'm actually going to remove it from store as well. So let's save that file. I'm going to copy that provider, and inside of our render method, what I'll do is I'll actually have that provider component at the very top. Make sure you put it at the very top of your tree. I'm going to close that same tag. And now the provider component is going to expect to have a single property, and it's called value. Now, value is going to contain the value for your context. We can create a method called getContext. So I'm going to add it as a method to the class. This one is going to return an object. We can basically extract all of the state. So I'll do 3 dots, this state, and we can also pass down the muscles. So let's do muscles. What this is going to do is it's going to create an object with the muscles property, as well as everything that's inside the state. And at the beginning, it's going to contain the exercises, and it's also going to contain the selected exercise. The provider component in this case is going to allow consumers to subscribe to the context. Now let's actually make use of the context inside of dialog. So I'm going to go to dialog.js, and then at the very top, I'm going to have an import statement of consumer. We're going to have to grab it from the context. We'll have to go 2 levels up. And now to consume the context, we're going to grab the consumer component. We're going to place it at the very top of the tree, just like the provider. So I'm going to close off the consumer tag. And now the consumer component is going to expect a render prop function. So we're going to have to provide a function, and that function is going to have a single argument. That argument refers to the value that you pass from the app component. So whatever you pass down to the value prop as your context is also going to be available in the consumer through the value prop in your render function. So I'm going to grab the fragment over here. I'm going to paste it into the render prop function. So what I'll do is for this value, I'm going to extract muscles out of it. I'm not going to destructure muscles from the props anymore because we're going to rely on the muscles on the context. So I'm going to save the file right now. And in fact, we don't need to pass the muscles through the header anymore, so I can actually remove them from over here. Inside of header, I don't need to destructure the muscles anymore, and I don't need to pass them down to the dialog either. So after removing those muscles, I can actually go back to the UI. Let's click on the plus icon, and now if you expand the drop-down dialog, you can see that the muscles still show up. And now just to reiterate, those muscles come from the app component. They're being passed down in the getContext method, and they're being extracted from the store at the top over here. Now, aside from passing data, we can also pass functions. So for example, in this case, the dialog needs to know about the onCreate function, and this one is being passed down from the header, and the header inherits that function from app over here. So let's make sure we add it to the context as well. I'm going to create an onCreate property on the context. We'll set it to this handle exercise create, and this will basically be a reference to the function. So whenever you invoke that onCreate function as a method, like that, it's actually going to internally invoke this handle exercise create. So we don't have to pass down that function through properties anymore. I'm going to remove it from the header element over here. I'm going to save this file. I'll remove it from the header component itself. So in this case, we'll just render the dialog itself. We don't need to pass any properties to it. So I'm going to save the file. And back in dialog, we're actually going to face a bit of a challenge over here because we can obviously access the onCreate function inside of the consumer, right? So inside of the render method, but we actually need to be able to access that function in handle form submit. Now, one way to go about this would be to create a higher order component. And this is exactly what I'm going to do. So I'll go back to context.js. What I'll do is I'll create a new export. This will be a higher order component, or in essence, just a helper function. I'll call it with context. The way I'd like to use this function is, let's say I have a dialog component. I'm going to have a dialog constant. When I do an export default of that dialog component, what I'd like to do is I'd like to call that with context function, and I'd like to pass the dialog down to that function. And this is just like calling, for instance, with router, just like you would do in React router library, for example, or just like calling with width in Material UI. They all kind of follow the same pattern. So this constant over here needs to be a function, which is going to need to accept a component. And then it's going to need to return a component function itself. So the first function refers to with context itself. But with context also needs to return an actual component. This component will be this function over here. It's basically going to use the consumer. So we're gonna have to put those two tags, and inside we'll have a render prop function. This one will actually use the component itself. It's going to pass down the value. So I'm gonna destructure the value. All of the keys are going to be destructured on the component and passed down as properties. And we're also going to have to destructure the properties themselves. So for instance, if the value contains muscles, so it could be an object, like let's say muscles, this would be an array. What this statement does is it basically destructures that property on the component. So in the end, it's equivalent to passing down the muscles like this with the array of muscles inside. And the same thing goes for the properties over here. And for this JSX syntax to work, we do actually need to import React in the end in this file. So I'm going to save it for the time being. I'm going to go back to dialog. And instead of using consumer like this, I'm actually going to import this helper function that we've just created. I'm going to have with context. And then instead of exporting an anonymous class, I'm going to actually give this class a name. Let's call it a dialog. In this case, it's actually going to conflict with the dialog from Material UI, but that's not a big deal. We can actually call it create dialog. So at the bottom of the file, I'm going to do a default export of with context, passing down the create dialog like that. I'm going to remove the consumer like I said, because we don't need it anymore. But at the same time, we're also going to need to destructure the two properties now. Now in this case, we only need the muscles. These ones are going to come from this props once again. But don't be confused. Those ones don't actually come from the header because we don't pass any properties to the dialog from the header. The only properties we're going to receive are the ones that are being passed down from the context. And now this onCreate function is going to work because it's also being contained on the props as well. So I can save this file once again. I can try to create an exercise. Let's put it in arms, test. And it looks like it worked. So that means we can now use context to access global state in our application. So to finish this off, I'm going to refactor the app to use context across the board. So I'm going to go to footer first of all. Let's actually refactor this component to a class-based component. Let's have a footer class that's going to extend a component. Inside, I'm actually going to create a few methods. So let's have an onIndex select method. Let's also have a render method as well, like we did before. We're going to return the appbar component. Let's have a return statement. Now for the index, this could as well be a method too. So let's have get index. So now for the default export, I'm going to put in the footer component, but we're also going to wrap it with our helper function. So this is going to be with context like this. Now we're going to need to import it as well. So let's import with context. This is going to come from context 2 levels up. We're going to need to have a component import as well. Now this function is going to need to extract a few things from the props. So I'll have a destructuring statement. Let's have onSelect. And this one, we can actually call it on category select because this one refers to the muscles. And we can also grab the muscles themselves. So let's grab them from this props. This function, right now we're not passing it in the app component, but we actually need to. So let me go back over here. I'm going to paste in a new property. This one is going to refer to a local method once again, and it's called handle category select. So I'm going to paste it in. Let's go back to our footer. I'm going to do the same thing for this method over here. In fact, it's going to be a function. I'm going to destructure a few things. We're going to need to get our category as well as muscles from this props, and we're going to need to return something. So let's return this ternary expression over here, and then we're going to need to change the onSelect constant to onCategory select to make this work. So now this index, we can actually get it from a local function. So let's do get index, and the onIndex select, this is actually a local method as well. So let's reference that. Finally, we have a width. Now this one comes from Material UI. So what I'll do is I'll have a destructuring statement of width on this props once again. And the muscles, we're going to need to reference them as well. These ones come from the context. So once we save it, we can now navigate between the different categories as well. Moving forward, let's also refactor index.js. Now this component is pretty heavy, and that's because we're passing a lot of different data down to that component. So let me go back to app.js. I'm going to finalize the list of methods over here. So we also have onEdit. This one is going to be this handle exercise edit. We also have on select edit. This one refers to this, handle exercise select edit, the last one. We also have on delete. This one will be this, handle exercise delete. And I think that's all of them. Let's go back to index. What I'll do is I'll actually put this into a separate constant. Let's call it exercises. This one is going to be a function. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an export at the very bottom. Let's have an export of exercises. We're going to wrap it with context. And once again, if we go back to the very top of the file, we're going to have an import. So let's import with context. From context, we're going to need to go 2 levels up. So now I can save the file, and then in the app component, let's make sure we're passing all of our data. The exercise comes from the state. It's basically this exercise over here. So we can remove it from the props. Also passing down the category. This one comes from the state as well. You could see that we're actually extracting it from the state over there. So we can remove it from the props again. We can also remove exercises. Now these exercises are actually exercises by muscles. So I think we do need to add them to the context. I think what we can do is we can have exercises by muscles. And this is going to be the array from this method over here. This one is going to take in the flat array, and it's basically going to sort the muscles by category. Now what else? We also have the edit mode, that's on the state, the muscles. Again, this comes from store.js file. So we have on select. Actually on select we do need to add still. I think this is the last method that we missed. This one is going to be this handle exercise select. We have on delete, we have on select edit, and then we have on edit itself. So I can now remove all of those properties. So we're actually reducing the code base quite a bit. I'm also going to remove all of those 3 properties from the footer as well. I'm also going to remove these constants. We don't need them anymore. And now instead of index.js, we need to get exercises by muscles like this. We're going to need to replace them over here. In the app component, we can also now remove the fragment because we now have a provider at the top. So I'm going to remove that. We don't need the fragment. We can remove it from the import statement as well. In the exercises component, well, now it's actually using the context. All of those properties come from this method, get context over here. Now we'll still have to pass down the properties to the form component. That's because we have the form component in 2 files. One of them is the exercises component, the one you're seeing right now. We also have the form inside of dialog, and we're actually passing different properties in different cases. So I think what I'll do is I'll keep those 2 properties as they are because they're going to change based on where the form is being used. Other than that, every other component uses context. So I think the refactor wasn't too bad in the end, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.